Welcome to History's What Ifs with Rambling Canuck and Honstar. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you, Rob?
Not too bad. So today we're gonna pull on Honstar's knowledge. Usually it's me knowing more about the topic, but I think today Honstar gets the nod. And we're gonna talk about what if the railroads in Canada and the United States don't happen when they do historically. How does that change the landscape? And at first glance, one might go, well, it will happen eventually and it'll be the same. But I don't think people really realize just how influential and um, important to the structure of both the United States and Canada the railroads were. So,
Yeah,
Han, I'll let you kind of lead off and we'll go from there.
and even today, how much the railroads change things, or are important.
Hmm.
I'll preface this with saying, as Rob already knows, I'm a locomotive engineer for a major Class One railroad in the United States for 17 years, so I know a little bit about trains,
He's been
driving
on
them,
one or two.
driving them anyway.
Yeah.
And like I was saying, talking about even today, people don't realize how much today is still moved by rail.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, truck. And I'm not getting down on truck drivers, but there's a large amount of goods that are still moved by rail. Because if it wasn't, nobody would be able to drive anywhere
Yeah.
because there'd be so many trucks,
Yeah.
and the cost would be way more.
Astronomical.
But yeah, but going back historically, it is a very interesting topic because, and like you said, people think, oh well, it would happen eventually, but they don't understand the time frame of how it moved up the settlement of the West. But before the railroads, other than wagon trains, it was basically from the Mississippi River east to the coast in the United States. And I don't know if Canada was similar or not in that, how localized it was, but I mean that at that time, even though we had all that land, that was basically the United States. Is because to go east, I mean, I'm sorry, west of the Mississippi, you had to have like ox and a wagon.
Mhm.
And there was some settlement like in California and stuff like that due to you know the ocean and steamer ships and stuff like that. But everything in the middle was just like this big open place,
Mhm.
and and I agree with you. I think the makeup of the United States, not just the West, but other places of the United States, would be way different if the railroad hadn't happened at all.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, eventually we would have went west of the Mississippi, but it would have been a much longer timeline.
Yeah, much longer, yeah. And at the time, what a lot of people don't always understand as well, I mean, at least it was the case in Canada, and I'm pretty sure I can speak pretty heavily on saying a lot of the cities we know today are there because a railroad went through them. Um, if the railroad had gone north, then that city wouldn't be as important as it is. If that railroad had gone south, it would have been that city that it went through that would have been the major city and the major hub of that area, not the city that is historically um, uh, the major hub, because the railroad really made or broke towns back in the day. Because if you couldn't get one, people there reliably, and two, supplies or military in a quick pinch, your town was done. It would be wherever the railroad went that would be the hub.
And there was actually politicking and payoffs and arguments as to where the railroad would actually take a route because people wanted it to go through where they own land or the area where they lived because again, like you said, if you're a stop on the railroad, now you're a city, now you're a town.
Yeah.
If you get bypassed by the railroad, you're just another place.
Yeah. You're another dot on the map.
The railroad was basically the new waterway
Yeah.
because historically bigger cities and towns have been built on like lakes, rivers, oceans because it's you have navigable waterways to get people and supplies in and out. The railroad changed that and made it like a steel river
Yeah.
that could go through the barren west at the time. And like you said, it would make or break an area. Did the railroad go here or did the railroad go here? That could make a total difference. And like you said, a lot of the bigger cities, especially out west, wouldn't even be there if it wasn't for the railroad.
Yeah. And I mean, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there is documented history of, a person who, was this creator of a town or a politician or mainly a politician would go to the railroad guys and go, well, we'll give you X amount of funding if you put your railroad through our town. They would buy the railroad in a sense. They would
Yeah.
buy, pay the railroad to come through their town, and they would bid on it. There'd be bidding. Well, we want the railroad to come through Philly. Well, no, we want the railroad to come through this town. Whoever won out, their town turned into a growing metropolis, whereas the town that didn't get the railroad ended up disappearing, lost to time, gone,
Yeah,
no
because
longer there.
and a lot of people have in their minds. I mean, there are towns that have survived later in time despite the railroad, because now we have the interstate systems and all that
Yeah,
stuff. At this time, you either had an ox and wagon or you had a train,
yeah,
and the place that had the train was going to prosper. And if you could only get there by horse or ox and wagon, it wasn't going to prosper as much as
no,
the
you
other.
were a backwater.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, people still live there. There was still trade and commerce there, but
Yeah,
not along the lines of somebody being attached to a railroad line.
yeah, and like um Winnipeg, for instance, is where it is because this is where the Red and the Assiniboine meet, which were two major trading rivers. So everybody met here. Um, so you'd have your traders coming up the Red or down the Red or east or west on the Assiniboine, and they'd all meet here in Winnipeg. So Winnipeg became a major hub that way in a trading post. It's a trading post. Then the railroad came through, and then it grew and grew, and now it's the monstrosity that it is. Um, and I can say that because I live here. But you know, Toronto wouldn't be Toronto if I mean, Toronto has the advantage of being near the Great Lakes, and that was Canada for the most part. Great Lakes and coastal. So you had Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes, a little bit into the prairies, but not very much because again, prairies. Well, you either had to get there by water or by caravan. So then, when you get out further west, and you look at somewhere like Banff Springs, which is a getaway for people who have money, um, that wouldn't exist without the railroad. Banff Springs would be non existent because it's up in the mountains, for one. And two, the only reason Banff got any major attraction was Canadian Pacific went through there, built a major hotel, and therefore a little community grew around that, and then they did the skiing, but without the hotel and the railroad bringing people there,
Yeah.
you could have all the ski jumps you wanted. There'd be no people to do the ski jumps, so
which is, and that's the railroads at the time. That was the railroads' mo, is they knew how far people wanted to travel in a day by the steam locomotives of the time. So you would convince me to go through your area, and then the railroad would build a railroad hotel. Build a really nice hotel.
Yeah.
A city or town would form around it because they're like, oh, well, Rob, you'll be on the train from this city to this city, and then you'll want to stay overnight.
Yeah.
So, railroad hotels kind of anchored in the towns that were stops along the way because, at the time, travel took however long. And okay, well, you're willing to travel from this point to this point in a day. And then you're going to want somewhere nice to stay overnight, eat and sleep and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then a city
Built
exploded around that.
around it. Yeah. Well, it's CN and CP both did it. Canadian Pacific and Canadian National. Well, once they became Canadian National. Um, Before that, there were four or five other railroads that went belly up because CP put them out of business, and then the government took over. But anyway, now they're private again. But CN and CP both did that. They'd have hotels. CP really, at one point, really maximized their entire thing. So CP at one point had CP ships. So you'd come in on a CP ship, you'd get board a CP train, you'd stay at a CP hotel, and they'd get your money in the shipping, in the transport, and in the staying all at once. And then when they really jumped the shark, you could go either by ship or by air because CP had both. So you could land with CP Air, or you could take a ship with CP. And then you'd land, you'd get on a CP train, and you'd stay at a CP hotel. So your entire trip, you were dealing with Canadian Pacific. They were just wearing different hats, taking your money. And I'm pretty sure there was American railroads that did the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, and like we are saying, the United States was basically the same way. You had California up the Pacific coast, and then you had the Mississippi east because navigable waterways again. The middle is the part that matters as far as the railroad goes. And like we said, eventually stuff would happen, but the timeline would have been much, 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 much longer.
Yeah. Yeah. Like eventually they would have got there. But with the railroads, because you got to remember for every passing year that we're talking, and you could be talking 5 years, you could be talking a year, 2 years, the landscape would have changed to where, well, 2 years ago, Dallas was starting. We'll just use that as an example. But it fell because nobody could get supplies, and this other town over here further north is a little bit easier to get through, and so now that's the main hub. Well, then that city never flourishes. That city never gets the push
Yeah,
that it got.
so many towns we know of being big metropolises today may either A, not exist, or B, be just small towns on the map.
Yeah, like for instance, the one I question is Vancouver. Would Vancouver be as big? Would Banff definitely would be just a spot on a map? Because getting through the Rockies was a major undertaking,
Yeah.
and getting that done, it took, even by the standards of the day, it took forever to get through there. At one point, it was thought unpassable. There was no way you were getting a train through there, not a chance. And then somebody decided, well, what we can
Yes.
do is we can make this spiral tunnel. And
Somebody
there's,
said, "Wait a minute, hold my beer. We're going through
yeah,
there."
yeah, hold my beer. We're going to do this. Um, and then so you get a whole bunch of those towns and cities and resorts that just don't exist in the new time frame because they didn't have a train. The train, in a lot of ways, when they say that in a slogan, the train built the United States and the train built Canada, it's not a joke and it's not a fancy catchphrase.
Yeah.
It's reality. Without the train, yes, you would have gotten progress west, but you would have probably gone more by horse and what a what a caravan could get to.
Yeah. So you're only going to push so far. So, like you said, if it takes weeks and months to get supplies, well, you don't want to push that far. I mean,
Yeah,
weeks maybe, because at that time travel was slower. So you would see west of the Mississippi in the United States, yeah, it would spread out some because it could come up the Mississippi and then you could transfer it by horse and wagon or whatever. And the same thing on the west coast of the United States, steamships and stuff could come into, California, and you would see some progression east of California, but there would be this whole part in the middle that were super, super hard to get to.
yeah.
So
And
why
I
is
mean,
any
eventually the rail would go, but where the rail would go would be the question. Because I
yeah,
don't think you, a lot of the towns and a lot of the cities that we know today are there because of a flip of a coin in a
or
lot of
money,
senses,
or
or
money.
money. But if the railroad doesn't go through at that exact time, there were some towns that were on the brink of either the railroad came through or it was done.
Yeah,
And so if you think about it that way, if the railroad collapses when it's historically being built, one, we have this human nature when something doesn't work the first time, we kind of shy away from doing it the second time.
yeah,
um, oh, that was tried once. It didn't work very well, right? It was too expensive. It cost a fortune. The labor was retarded. And don't cancel me because I use that word. But anyway, the labor was insane. No, it's just not doable. It's not doable. And then the naysayers would have gotten a bigger grasp and a bigger foothold, and it would have been delayed for years, much longer than it took in in our timeline. And I think by then other cities would have popped or other towns would have popped up, and then you would have had more towns bidding on that rail where the railways and the towns we know today would be very different.
yeah. And there could be, on this alternate timeline, there would be major cities that aren't even cities today, just because in the later timeline they were able to bid to get the railroad through there.
Yeah. I mean, if
'Cause-
the easy way to look at this is if you want to put a more modern spin on this is take a look at what happened to towns. I know in Canada it happened, and I know in the United States it's happened because I've seen documentaries on it. But you look at towns pre uh, uh, overpasses and freeways that flourished,
yeah, yeah,
and then once that new highway went in that was a little further north of them, that town you go through now, it's lucky to
it,
have a bank in it.
it was the more modern version of what happened with the spread of the railroads. The
Yeah.
interstate system is just a more modern version of that.
Yeah.
And like you said, there's many, many towns. They may still exist, but they're just small little towns
Yeah.
because maybe the interstate went 10 miles north of them
Yeah.
instead of
Where
through their town.
yeah, where the old, the old way of getting somewhere, you had to go through that town. So they'd make money on hotel and restaurants and whatever, your basic commerce. Well, when the interstate goes through and the interstate's a little bit further north, well, now you all that traffic's diverted away from that town, and that town doesn't get people going through it anymore. And then it
Yeah.
becomes a backwater, a little small blip on the map that nobody knows exists for the most part. And it was the same thing with the railroad. If the railroad went north or south of that town, it almost it put the death nail in that town.
And and a lot of people today don't think about the railroads because there's not as much passenger rail travel and things like that. But
Mhm.
another way to look at it is if you look at a map of Canada or the United States, the major interstate systems, most towns, I should say cities, most cities, their major hubs of multiple interstates interchanges are also railroad hubs.
Mhm. Wonder why
So,
that happens.
yeah,
Uh, who'd have thunk it? Um, but it is a very interesting thing to think about because we take for granted just how, by the toss of a coin or toss of a dollar bill, where we live is where we live.
yeah,
Because it really depended on so many things going right that if too many things went wrong, we would have a very different United States and we'd have a very different Canada. Now, I'm not saying that everything would be barren wasteland because
yeah. I mean, it, yeah, it all would
eventually
have eventually got
the
settled.
rail would be laid. Eventually, the trains would run. Eventually, all this would happen. It would happen regardless. It would just take more time. And with the passage of time, I mean, just look at any highway project to date. The original project called for the interstate to run through here, and then they decided, well, it is a little bit of a pain in the ass to get the road to go through there, and it takes a little bit more time. If we move the road up a little bit, it'll cut down time to get from point A to point B, and we just move it a little further north or south, and it's a better route. Well, then that town or that city that they just bypassed, and it's usually not a city they bypass, but it's a town. That town they just bypassed is going to lose all that traffic that they used to have.
Yeah,
It happens every day, at least twice. Where a road development is changed, roads are rerouted and diverted because modern day we want to save time. If you can get there in 30 minutes, but you can make the road so you get there in 20 minutes, well, change the road. I want to be
yeah,
there in 20 minutes. What the hell? Why are we going through this snake road? Just build it straight through. What the hell? Well, the towns along that route that you just axed are now going to suffer because all the traffic they used to have isn't coming through that town.
yeah.
Even if it was 20 cars a day. Well, you go 20 cars a day down to 2 cars a day or no cars a day, it affects the income of that town. And it's the same thing with the railroad. If the railroad didn't go through your town, you were hooped for the most part.
And even today, a lot of people don't think about trains today because there's not as much passenger travel. But even today, the railroad I work for, we interchange with West Coast railroads in like Mississippi or Tennessee. There's still trains that come from like the port in Long Beach all the way to the East Coast.
Yep.
There is still coast to coast commerce going on by train.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but international.
Yeah.
Because Canada and the United States, I mean, if you know where in the city to go, you can see a BNSF train here in Winnipeg.
And we get I have been on trains here that they're mostly grain trains. I've been on trains here that have full CN or CP engines on them because
Yep.
they came all the way from Canada and they're going somewhere in the southern United States
Yep.
from Canada, and they get interchanged in Chicago or somewhere with the railroad I work for, and they go all the way down somewhere in the southern United States, and they started in Canada,
Yep.
and vice versa.
Vice versa. It goes the other way too.
Yeah.
And but we don't see it as much because it's just become the norm. But I mean, what rail has done for the Canada and the United States alone is is astounding. And it really did map the countries we now live in. Without rail, we would be in a very different country.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, so we're gonna go with final thoughts. Han, you take the lead on this one.
My final thought would be, if you want to broach this subject on a smaller scale, there's a book called Last Train to Paradise: Henry Flagler and the Spectacular Rise and Fall of the Railroad That Crossed an Ocean. Henry Flagler, if I could speak English, Henry Flagler is the one that started the FEC, the Florida East Coast Railroad, which goes from um, Jacksonville, Florida to Miami. But he made it go from Jacksonville, Florida to Key West. And the point was, people from up north on vacation would come on the northern railroads to Jacksonville, get on his trains, and all the East Coast cities of Florida are basically like we were talking about with the other conversation we had about the West. All the major cities on the East Coast of Florida are basically there because of Henry Flagler and his railroad.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, the railroad did go to Key West, although it doesn't go to Key West anymore. It ends in Miami. But the point was, you would come down from New York or whatever in the winter, make it to Jacksonville, get on the Florida East Coast Railroad, go all the way to Key West, and then you would take a steamship from Key West to Cuba, which was a hot spot, you know, to go to as like a tourist destination at the time. There was casinos and all kinds of stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
all that stuff you don't have there now. But if you're interested in history and want like a more smaller scale version of the conversation we had about the whole country, it's a very interesting book to read because it points out basically on a smaller scale everything that we just talked about.
Yeah. All right. Well, I hope you've at least enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure there's many points that we didn't get to, and dates and exact figures, but we were more doing a major overlook and just having a brain exercise, which is what these are at the end of the day. Um, if you enjoyed it, please do give a like, share. I am trying to get the channel up to 400 by April 22nd, which happens to be my birthday. So if we could get there, yay. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed. And until next time, take her easy, folks.